British bill and taxpayer?
Given earlier exchanges, the county in which I live, Flintshire, has only 2 electronic charging points. Is the Minister able to set targets for rural areas as well as urban areas on charging points?
Makes an excellent point, and it's true that the charging network needs to extend right across the country if people are to have the confidence that they will be able to recharge their vehicle, and the rural aspect is very much in mind.
Thank you
very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, according to the press, the Secretary of State gave a presentation to the subcommittee of the Cabinet about the automotive section and how important it was that we do not have a hard Brexit. Mr. Speaker, it seems to have persuaded those members of the Cabinet that it might be a good idea we should have a hard Brexit, that in fact it would be a very bad idea for British business, notably the automotive sector. On that basis, could the Secretary of State make it available to all right honourable and honourable members?
Very helpful. What I would say to my right honourable friend is that it would be wrong of me to disclose what are conversations in Cabinet. She understands the requirement of collective responsibility, but it is no secret to anyone in this House that I regard the success of the automotive sector, depending on integrated supply chains, as being good evidence of what type of trade agreement is needed, and it was referenced, indeed highlighted in the excellent speech by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister at the Mansion House.
Thank you. Order. Statement. The Chancellor of the Exchequer. Hammond.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce to the House the first spring statement. The UK was the only major economy to make hundreds of tax and spending changes twice a year, and major international organisations and UK professional bodies alike have been pressing for change. In 2016, I took the decision to move to a single fiscal event in the autumn, giving greater certainty to families and businesses ahead of the new financial year and allowing more time for stakeholder and parliamentary engagement on potential fiscal changes. So today's statement will update the House on the economic and fiscal position, report progress on announcements made at the 2 budgets last year, and launch further consultations ahead of Budget 2018, as set out today in my written ministerial statement. I won't be producing a red book today, Mr. Speaker, but of course I can't speak for the right honourable gentleman opposite. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to report today to the House on a UK economy that has grown in every year since 2010. An economy which, under Conservative leadership, now has a manufacturing sector enjoying its longest unbroken run of growth for 50 years. An economy which has added 3 million jobs and seen every single region of the UK with higher employment and lower unemployment than in 2010, seen the wages of the lowest paid up by almost 7% above inflation since April 2015, and income inequality lower than at any time under the last Labour government. Solid progress towards building an economy that works for everyone. So, Mr. Speaker, I reject the party opposite's doom and gloom about the state of the nation. Every Wednesday, we have to listen to the Leader of the Opposition relentlessly talking Britain down. And every year since 2010, we've had to listen to the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington predict a recession, none of which have actually happened. So, Mr. Speaker, if there are any Eeyores in the chamber, they're over there. I, meanwhile, am at my most positively Tigger-like today as I contemplate a country which faces the future with unique strengths. Our language is the global language of business. Our legal system is the jurisdiction of choice for commerce. We host the world's most global city and its international finance and professional services capital. Our companies are in the vanguard of the technological revolution, while our world-class universities are delivering the breakthrough discoveries and inventions that are powering it. British culture and talent reaches huge audiences across the globe, and our tech sector is attracting skills and capital from the four corners of the earth, with a new tech business being founded somewhere in the UK every hour, producing world-class products, including apps like TransferWise, CityMapper, Matt Hancock. Mr. Speaker, today the OBR delivers its second report for the fiscal year 2017-18, and I thank Robert Choate and his team for their work. It forecasts more jobs, rising real wages, declining inflation, a falling deficit and a shrinking debt. The economy grew by 1.7% in 2017 compared to 1.5% forecast at the budget, and the OBR have revised up their forecast for 2018 from 1.4% to 1.5%. Forecast growth is then unchanged at 1.3% in 2019 and 20, before picking up to 1.4% in 21 and 1.5% in 22. That's the OBR's forecast, Mr. Speaker, but forecasts are there to be beaten. As a nation, we did it in 2017, and we should make it our business to do so again. Our remarkable jobs story is set to continue, with the OBR forecasting more jobs in every year of this Parliament and over 500,000 more people enjoying the security of a regular pay packet by 2022. I'm pleased to report that the OBR expect inflation, which is currently above target at 3%, to fall back to target over the next 12 months, meaning that real wage growth is expected to be positive from the first quarter of 2018-19 and to increase steadily thereafter. Mr. Speaker, I reported in the autumn that borrowing was due to fall in every year of the forecast and debt to fall as a share of GDP from 2018-19. The OBR confirms this today and further revises down debt and borrowing in every year. Borrowing is now forecast to be £45.2 billion this year, £4.7 billion lower than forecast in November, and £108 billion lower than in 2010, which coincidentally, Mr. Speaker, is almost exactly the total cost of the additional spending pledges made by the party opposite since the general election in June last year. Mr. Speaker, it's taken them just 9 months to work up a plan to squander the fruits of 8 years' hard work by the British people. As a percentage of GDP, borrowing is forecast to be 2.2% in 17-18, falling to 1.8% in 18-19, 1.6% in 19-20, then 1.3%, 1.1%, and finally 0.9% in 22-23, meaning that in 18-19 we will run a small current surplus, borrowing only for capital investment. And we're forecast to meet our cyclically adjusted borrowing target in 2021 with £15.4 billion of headroom to spare, broadly as forecast at the budget. Mr. Speaker, the more favourable outlook for borrowing means the debt forecast is nearly 1% lower than in November, peaking at 85.6% of GDP in 17-18 and then falling to 85.5% in 18-19, then 85.1%, 82.1%, 78.3%, and finally 77.9% in 22-23. The first sustained fall in debt in 17 years. A turning point in this nation's recovery from the financial crisis of a decade ago. Light at the end of the tunnel. Another step on the road to rebuilding the public finances decimated by the party opposite. And, Mr. Speaker, one that they would again place at risk, because under the policies of the party opposite, our debt would not fall over the next 5 years. It would rise by over £350 billion to more than 100% of our GDP, undermining our recovery, threatening investment in British jobs, burdening the next generation and wasting billions and billions of pounds more on debt interest. So, Mr. Speaker, there is indeed light at the end of the tunnel, but we have got to make absolutely sure that it isn't the Shadow Chancellor's train hurtling out of control in the other direction towards Labour's next economic train wreck. Mr. Speaker, in autumn 2016, I changed the fiscal rules to give us more flexibility to adopt a balanced approach to repairing the public finances, reducing debt, not for some ideological reason, but to secure our economy, against future shocks. Because, Mr. Speaker, we on this side are not so naive as to think that we have abolished the economic cycle. Because we want to see taxpayers' money funding our schools and our hospitals not wasted on debt interest. And because we want to give the next generation a fair chance. But, Mr. Speaker, I do not agree with those who argue that every available penny must be used to reduce the deficit. And nor do I agree with the fiscal fantasists opposite who argue that every available penny should be spent immediately. We will continue to deliver a balanced approach, balancing debt reduction against the need for investment in Britain's future, support to hard-working families through lower taxes, and our commitment to our public services. Judge me by my record, Mr. Speaker. Judge me by my record. We'll see, Mr. Speaker, if they've done their homework. They might be surprised. Since autumn statement 2016, I have committed to £60 billion of new spending, shared between long-term investment in Britain's future and support for our public services, with almost £9 billion extra for our NHS and our social care system, £4 billion going into the NHS in 2018-19 alone. And as I promised at the autumn budget, more to come if, as I hope, management and unions reach an agreement on a pay modernisation deal for our nation's nurses and Agenda for Change staff, who have worked tirelessly since the autumn in very challenging circumstances to provide the NHS care that we all value so highly. £2.2 billion more on education and skills, and £31 billion going to fund infrastructure, R&D and housing through the National Productivity Investment Fund, taking public investment in our schools, hospitals and infrastructure in this Parliament to its highest sustained level in 40 years. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, we've cut taxes for 31 million working people by raising the personal allowance again in line with our manifesto commitment, taking more than 4 million people out of tax altogether since 2010. Freezing fuel duty for an 8th successive year, taking the saving for a typical car driver to £850 compared to Labour's plans, and raising the national living wage to £7.83 from next month, giving the lowest paid in our society a well-deserved pay rise of over £2,000 for a full-time worker since 2015. Mr. Speaker, since becoming Chancellor, I have provided an extra £11 billion of funding for 2018-19 to help with short-term public spending pressures and to invest in Britain's future. In the longer term, I can confirm that at this year's budget, I will set an overall path for public spending for 2020 and beyond, with a detailed spending review to take place in 2019 to allocate funding between departments. That is how responsible people budget. First, you work out what you can afford, then you decide what your priorities are, and then you allocate between them. And if, in the autumn, the public finances continue to reflect the improvements that today's report hints at, then in accordance with our balanced approach and using the flexibility provided by the fiscal rules, I would have capacity to enable further increases in public spending and investment in the years ahead, while continuing to drive value for money to ensure that not a single penny of precious taxpayers' money is wasted. A balanced approach, Mr. Speaker, getting our debt down, supporting our public services, investing in our nation's future, keeping taxes low, building a Britain fit for the future, and an economy that works for everyone. Mr. Speaker, there is much still to do. Since autumn 2016, we have set out our plan to back the enterprise and ambition of British business and the hard work of the British people. A plan to unleash our creators and our innovators, our inventors and our discoverers, to embrace the new technologies of the future and to deliver the skills we will need to benefit from them, to tackle our long-standing productivity challenges and to say more loudly than ever that our economy will remain open and outward-looking, confident to compete with the best in the world. We choose to champion those who create the jobs and the wealth on which our prosperity and our public services both depend, not to demonise them. The Shadow Chancellor, Mr. Speaker, is open about his ideological desire to undermine the market economy, which has driven an unparalleled increase in our living standards over the last 50 years. We on this side reject his approach outright. The market economy embraces talent and creates opportunity, provides jobs for millions and the tax revenues that underpin our public services. So we will go on supporting British businesses. We're reducing business rates by over £10 billion, and we committed at Autumn Budget 2017 to move to triennial revaluations from 2022. Today, I'm pleased to announce that we will bring forward the next business rates revaluation to 2021 and move to triennial reviews from that date. We will also launch a call for evidence to understand how best we can help the UK's least productive businesses to learn from and catch up with the most productive, and another on how we can eliminate the continuing scourge of late payments, a key ask from small business. Because, Mr. Speaker, we are the party of small business and the champions of the entrepreneur. Since the budget, we've made substantial progress in our negotiations with the European Union to deliver a Brexit that supports British jobs, businesses and prosperity. And, Mr. Speaker, I look forward, I don't know what the honourable gentleman does, but I look forward to another important step forward at the European Council next week. But we will continue to prepare for all eventualities. And today, my right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, is publishing the departmental allocations of over £1.5 billion of Brexit preparation funding for 2018-19, which I announced at the autumn budget. Our modern industrial strategy sets out our plan to keep Britain at the forefront of new technologies, with the biggest increase in public R&D spending for 4 decades. Much of this new technology depends on high-speed broadband, and today I can make the first allocations of the £190 million local full-fibre challenge fund announced at autumn budget and confirm £25 million for the first 5G test beds. As our economy changes, we must ensure people have the skills they need to seize the opportunities ahead. So we've committed over £500 million a year to T-levels, the most ambitious post-16 reforms in 70 years. And from next month, £50 million will be available to help employers prepare for the rollout of T-level work placements. Last week, the Education Secretary and I chaired the first meeting of the National Retraining Partnership between the Government, the TUC and the CBI. And I can reassure the House, Mr. Speaker, that there was no beer, no sandwiches, not even a canapé, but there was a clear and shared commitment to training to prepare the British people for a better future ahead. And next month, our £29 million Construction Skills Fund will open for bids to fund up to 20 construction skills villages around the country. We're committed as a government to delivering 3 million apprenticeship starts by 2020 with the support of business through the apprenticeship levy. But we recognise the challenges the new system presents to some small businesses looking to employ an apprentice. So I can announce today that my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, will release up to £80 million of funding to support those small businesses in engaging an apprentice. We published a consultation on improving the way the tax system supports self-funded training by employees and the self-employed, and because we currently understand more about the economic payback from investing in our infrastructure than we do about investing in our people, I have asked the ONS to work with us on developing a more sophisticated measure of human capital so that future investment can be better targeted. Mr. Speaker, we're undertaking the largest road building programme since the 1970s. As Transport Secretary, I gave the green light to fund the new bridge across the River Mersey in 2011, and I was delighted to see it open late last year. The largest infrastructure project in Europe, Crossrail, is due to open in just 9 months' time. We're making progress on our plans to deliver the Cambridge, Milton Keynes, Oxford corridor. We're devolving powers and budgets to elected mayors across the Northern Powerhouse and Midlands Engine. We're in negotiations for city deals with Stirling and Clackmannanshire, Tay Cities, Borderlands, North Wales, Mid Wales and Belfast. And today we invite proposals from cities across England for the £840 million fund I announced at the budget to deliver on their local transport priorities as part of our plans to spread growth and opportunity to all parts of this United Kingdom. And at the heart of our plan for building an economy that works for everyone is our commitment to tackle the challenges in our housing market, with an investment programme of £44 billion to raise housing supply to 300,000 a year by the mid-2020s. And today I can update the House. We are working currently, my right honourable friend, the Housing Minister, is working currently with 44 authorities who have bid into the £4.1 billion Housing Infrastructure Fund to unlock homes in areas of high demand. We're concluding housing deals with ambitious authorities who've agreed to deliver above their local housing need. And I can announce today that we've just agreed a deal with the West Midlands, who have committed to deliver 215,000 homes by 2030-31, facilitated by a £100 million grant from the Land Remediation Fund. And my right honourable friend, the Housing Minister, will make further announcements over the next few days on the Housing Infrastructure Fund. We will more than double the size of the Housing Growth Partnership with Lloyds Banking Group to £220 million, providing additional finance for small builders. And London will receive an additional £1.7 billion to deliver a further 26,000 affordable homes, including homes for social rent, taking total affordable housing delivery in London to over 116,000 by the end of 21-22. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, has outlined his initial findings on the gap between planning permissions granted and housing completions in a letter which I have placed in the Library of the House, and I look forward to his full report at budget. And I'm delighted to inform the House that an estimated 60,000 first-time buyers have already benefited from the stamp duty relief that I announced at the autumn budget. And I remind the House that the party opposite voted against it. In the autumn, we published a paper on taxing large digital businesses in the global economy, and today we follow up with a publication that explores potential solutions. And I look forward to discussing this issue with G20 finance ministers in Buenos Aires at the weekend. We also publish a call for evidence on how online platforms can help their users to pay the right amount of tax, and we will consult on a new VAT collection mechanism for online sales to ensure that the VAT that consumers pay actually reaches the Treasury. And we'll call for evidence too on how to encourage cashless and digital payments while ensuring that cash remains available to those who need it. Mr. Speaker, this government is determined that our generation should leave the natural environment in a better state than we found it and improve the quality of the air that we breathe. So we will publish a call for evidence on whether the use of non-agricultural red diesel tax relief contributes to poor air quality in urban areas. And following our successful intervention to incentivise clean taxis, we'll help the great British white van driver go green with a consultation on reduced VED rates for the cleanest vans. And we'll follow up on the vital issue of plastic littering and the threat to our oceans with a call for evidence to support us in delivering on our vow to tackle this complex issue. It will look at the whole supply chain for single-use plastics, at alternative materials, reusable options and recycling opportunities. It will look at how the tax system can help drive the technological progress and behavioural change that we need, not as a way of raising revenue, but as a way of changing behaviour and encouraging innovation. We'll commit to investing to develop new, greener products and processes, funded from the revenues that are raised. And as a down payment, Mr. Speaker, we'll award £20 million now from existing departmental budgets to businesses and universities to stimulate new thinking and rapid solutions in this area during the call for evidence. Mr. Speaker, we are delivering on our plan with a balanced approach, restoring the public finances, investing in our economy and our public services, raising productivity through our modern industrial strategy, building the homes our people need, tackling the environmental challenges that threaten our future, embracing technological change, seizing the opportunities ahead as we build our vision of a country that works for everyone, an economy where prosperity and opportunity are in reach of all, wherever they live, whatever their gender, colour, creed or background, where talent and hard work alone determine success, a beacon of enterprise and innovation, an outward-looking free trading nation, one that is confident that our best days lie ahead of us, a force for good in the world, Mr. Speaker, a country we can all be proud to pass on to our children. And I commend this statement to the House.
John McDonnell. Let me thank the Chancellor for providing me with an earlier sight of his statement. But I have to say to the Chancellor, his complacency today is astounding. We face, in every public service, a crisis on a scale we've never seen before. Hasn't he listened to the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the police officers, the carers, and even his own councillors? They're telling him they can't wait for the next budget. They're telling him to act now. For 8 years they've been ignored by this government, and today they've been ignored again. The Chancellor has proclaimed today that there's light at the end of the tunnel. This shows just how cut off from the real world he is. Last year, growth in our economy was among the lowest in the G7, the slowest since 2012. The OBR have just predicted we will scrape along the bottom for future years. Wages are lower now in real terms than they were in 2010, and they're still falling. According to the Resolution Foundation, the changes to benefits due to come in next month will leave 11 million families worse off. And you know, as always, the harshest cuts fall on the disabled people. The gap in productivity between this country and the rest of the G7 is almost the widest for a generation. UK industry is 20 to 30% less productive than in other major economies. And why? Well, in part, the reason is that investment by this government, in real terms, is nearly £18 billion below its 2010 level. And this is a government that cut R&D, research and development, funding by £1 billion in real terms. Business investment stagnated in the last quarter of 2017. And despite all the promises, the government continues to fail to address the regional imbalances in investment. London again will receive 5 times more transport investment than Yorkshire and Humberside and the North. This is a government on climate change. How dare they speak? This is a government that single-handedly destroyed the solar industry. 12,000 jobs lost as a result of subsidy cuts. The Chancellor talks about the fourth industrial revolution, but Britain has the lowest. The Chancellor talks about the fourth industrial revolution, but Britain has the lowest rate of industrial robot use in the OECD. The government has put £75 million into its artificial intelligence programme. That's less than a tenth of what the US is spending. The Chancellor has made great play this week. The Tory bully boys can shout all they want.
There'll be a full opportunity for people to contribute, but the right honourable gentleman must be heard. John McDonnell.
Mr. Speaker, they can shout all they want, they can make their snide remarks. People out there know the crisis in our community. The Chancellor's made great play this week of reaching a turning point in reducing the deficit and the debt. It's a bit rich coming from a party that's put £700 billion on the national debt over the last 8 years. And it's worth remembering, this is a party that promised us that the deficit would be eliminated completely by 2015, 2016. And bizarrely, his predecessor, now ensconced in the Evening Standard, or is it BlackRock, or the Washington Speakers Bureau, whatever number of jobs he now has, his predecessor has been tweeting about achieving 3 years late a deficit target that he actually abandoned himself. The reality is that the Chancellor and his predecessor have not tackled the deficit. What they've done is they've shifted it onto the public services his colleagues are responsible for. He's shifted it onto the Secretary of State for Health and the shoulders of NHS managers and doctors and nurses throughout the country. NHS trusts will end this financial year £1 billion in deficit. Doctors and nurses are struggling, being asked to do more and more while there's 100,000 NHS posts going unfilled. Does the Chancellor really believe the NHS can wait another 8 months for the life-saving funds it needs? How many people have to die waiting in an ambulance before he acts? He's mentioned the pay offers to the NHS staff we're expecting shortly. That was forced upon him by the Labour Party and trade unions campaign against the pay cap. But let me say this to him. Taking away a day's holiday from those dedicated staff is mean-spirited. And I ask him now, will he drop this miserly act? The Chancellor has also shifted the deficit onto the Secretary of State for Education and head teachers, with the first per capita cut in schools funding since the 1990s. And today, the government is even trying to deprive 1 million children of a decent school dinner. So I'm asking the Chancellor, and I'm asking every Conservative MP, if there's... Order. The House must calm down. There will be plenty of opportunity for questioning from members in all parts of the House. The right honourable gentleman must be heard. John McDonnell. So I'm appealing to Tory MPs today. If they're serious about ending austerity, to vote with us this afternoon to give those children the free school meal they're entitled to. The Chancellor has shifted the deficit onto the Home Secretary and Justice Secretary. Crime is rising, yet he's cut the number of police officers by 21,500, the number of firefighters by 8,500, and our prisons and probation service are in dangerous crisis. In shifting the deficit onto the shoulders of the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, in reality, he's shifted this burden onto local councillors. Yes, Labour, Lib Dem and Conservative councillors alike. So I raise again the stark reality of what this means for the most vulnerable children in our society. There's been a 40% cut in early intervention to support families. The result is the highest number of children taken into care since the 1980s. Children's charities, not us, children's charities are saying this: this crisis could turn into a catastrophe without further funding. And also last year, 400 women seeking refuge were turned away because there were no places available for them in refuges. And there are now nearly 5,000 of our fellow citizens sleeping rough on our streets, more than double than it was in 2010. And tragically, one of our homeless citizens died only feet away from the entrance to Parliament. He's mentioned additional housing funding. He mentioned London. The additional housing funding announced for London today is not a new announcement. This is money already announced. Any new funding is welcome, but it's simply not enough, and it represents a cut in London's budgets compared with the money Labour allocated in 2010. There are 1 million vulnerable older people who have no access to the social care they need. Conservative councils are going bust. Many will be forced to hike up council tax. Councils are running out of reserves, as the National Audit Office explained to us. So I ask the Chancellor, will he listen to Conservative council leaders, like his own in Surrey, who said, and I quote, "We're facing the most difficult financial crisis in our history. The government cannot stand idly by while Rome burns." And I ask him, how many more children have to come into care? How many more councils have to go bust? How many more have to run out of reserves before he wakes up to this crisis and acts? Today's statement could have been a genuine turning point, but it is, depressingly, another missed opportunity. People know now that austerity was a political choice, not an economic necessity. The Conservatives chose to cut taxes for the super-rich, the corporations and the bankers, and it was paid for by the rest of us in society. They even cut the levy on bankers in last month's Finance Act. We were never all in this together, as they claimed, never. They cut investment at the very time when we should have been developing the skills and infrastructure needed to raise productivity and grasp, yes, the technological revolution with both hands. And when they had a responsibility to meet the challenge of Brexit, we have a Chancellor who this weekend admitted he hasn't even modelled the government's options. Today we have the indefensible spectacle of a Chancellor congratulating himself on marginally improved economic forecasts, while he refuses to lift a finger as councils go bust, the NHS and social care in crisis, school budgets are cut, homelessness has doubled and wages are falling. This isn't a government preparing our country for the future, it's a government setting us up to fail.
Councillor of the Exchequer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman supported the switch to a single fiscal event, and now he's complaining that I haven't delivered a mini-budget today. I'm not surprised that he cannot quite understand anybody passing up the opportunity to introduce some new taxes, because that's what a Labour government would be doing, not once a year, not twice a year, but every other week, Mr. Speaker. And he talks about Tory bully boys. I heard him referring to some of my honourable friends as Tory bully boys. Can I just remind the House, this is the man who still refuses to apologise to my right honourable friend, the Work and Pensions Secretary. So I don't want to hear anything about bullying. I don't want to hear anything about bullying from the benches opposite. The public will draw its own conclusions. He knows his Lenin, of course. The task is to win power, and that's why we see from the honourable gentleman the smooth, reassuring mien of the bank manager. But every now and again, the mask slips, Mr. Speaker, and we get a glimpse of the sinister ideology that lies beneath, an ideology that would wreck our economy if he ever gets anywhere near the controls, threatening confiscation, dismissing property rights, undermining the cornerstones of our economy and the basis of our freedom and prosperity. He talks about political choices. Let me tell him, Mr. Speaker, the political choices we've made. We've closed the tax gap to one of the lowest in the developed world. We've raised £175 billion by 100 measures against tax evasion and avoidance. We're collecting 28% of all income tax from the richest 1% in our country, a higher percentage than in any year under Labour. He says real wages are falling. I've got good news for him. The OBR expects real wages to rise from Q1 2018, which, in case he hasn't worked it out, starts in 2 weeks' time. He talks about spending on the disabled. Well, I've got good news for him again. Spending on the disabled will be higher in every year of this Parliament. He talks about research and development to support our economy, and research and development spending is at record highs. And he reels out the same old bogus statistics on regional distribution. I think he's got the briefing from Russia today, Mr. Speaker. Let me just tell him this. The Infrastructure Authority has published figures which clearly show that the highest per capita spending on transport infrastructure investment is in the northwest region, Mr. Speaker, not, the last time I checked, one of the southern regions. All regions have benefited from the boom in employment. All regions will end this Parliament with lower unemployment and higher employment. He talks about £700 billion of increased national debt. Well, yes, Mr. Speaker, we have had to deal with the legacy of Labour's meltdown in 2009 because it didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. Our historic function is to clean up Labour's mess, and my report today shows that we're doing it once again. He talks about funding for the NHS. I've put £9 billion into the NHS since autumn statement 2016. He talks about school budgets. School budgets are increasing in per capita, per pupil terms, in real terms. And on children's services, he must know that Department for Education research shows that spending on the most vulnerable children has increased by around £500 million in real terms since 2010. We've committed £1 billion to tackle rough sleeping and homelessness and made a manifesto pledge to eliminating rough sleeping by 2027 and halve it by 2022. Mr. Speaker, no one watching our exchanges today can be in any doubt that Britain faces a choice. We have a plan to get our economy growing. The Shadow Chancellor says it doesn't matter whether GDP grows or not. We have a plan to get people on the housing ladder, while the Shadow Chancellor doesn't want, quotes, to get bogged down in property rights. We have a plan to deal with our debts. The Shadow Chancellor wants to send debt soaring because he fantasises that he can borrow for free. So the choice is clear. Our vision of a dynamic, modern economy, or the party opposite's vision of an inward-looking, narrow-minded country. Because we have to win this argument, Mr. Speaker, because if we don't, it will be ordinary people, not the rich and the powerful, not the globally mobile, but ordinary people who will pay the price, as they always do for Labour's failure.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my right honourable friend on his very forceful statement based on competent government and grown-up politics, which are worlds the Shadow Chancellor will never enter. But when he comes to prepare his budget for November, I'm sure he will be looking for any new source of taxation which may be needed to put even more money than he already has into the NHS and social care, which are facing vast increases in demand. Can I suggest that he looks at some of the extraordinary tax anomalies he's inherited in the tax treatment of older, prosperous people in full-time work in this country? It cannot be right.
Declare your interest. Declare your interest.
I think I'm perfectly well placed to make my point and cannot be accused of personal bias. It is absurd that older employees actually pay less tax than their younger colleagues on their income because they don't pay national insurance. It cannot be right that people in large houses enjoying capital gains from the housing market have those disregarded for means test purposes if they ever need certain types of social care. So as the early budgets in a parliament are a time for tough and difficult decisions, will my honourable friend, right honourable friend, let me know that he will be looking at those much overdue anomalies that need to be addressed. Some justice between the generations, I think, is being demanded by our constituents.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm a very great fan of the concept of intergenerational fairness, and as my right honourable friend, my right honourable and learned friend will know, as a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, all Chancellors look at all options in the run-up to every budget, and I can undertake to him that I will do so in the run-up to Budget 2018. And in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, I can tell my right honourable friend that there is a mechanism for voluntary donations to Her Majesty's Treasury, and in case he's mislaid it, I will send him a copy of our bank details.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say that was much ado about nothing, and the real tragedy is that we're 10 years on from the financial crisis, that austerity is still with us, and there was a lack of hope given to the people of the United Kingdom from this statement today. Mr. Speaker, at the weekend we saw the honourable member for Murray in his other job as a linesman at the Glasgow Celtic versus Rangers football match, waving his flag enthusiastically, calling for a red card. If anybody deserves a red card today, it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But, Mr. Speaker, we hear the Chancellor proclaiming that we've had consistent economic growth since 2010, that we can look forward to continued economic growth over the course of the coming years. But the reality is, in 2019, when we're supposed to be leaving the European Union, that the OBR is predicting that growth will be a measly 1.3% and is forecast to remain at round about 1.5% over the coming years, significantly below what has been the historic trend line of growth for this country. And when I hear the Chancellor talking about wage growth, he ought to reflect that we've got a lost decade of wage growth in the United Kingdom. But let me prick his balloon as far as this one's concerned, because the OBR book is very clear that real earnings growth will remain subdued for the next 5 years. That's the reality, and perhaps the Chancellor should stop spinning and become honest with people as to what is going to happen. Now, he talks about light at the end of the tunnel. Let me tell him the light at the end of the tunnel is a hard Brexit and the impact of lower growth, which is going to cost jobs and prosperity in this country. Mr. Speaker, slow earnings growth, higher inflation and cuts to the benefit system are resulting in falling incomes for the poorest households and rising inequality. Once again, the Chancellor has failed to bring his government's disastrous austerity programme to an end. And worse still, he has his head firmly in the sand over Brexit. Mr. Speaker, this government is going ahead with a devastating cut to Scotland's budget. Well, I hear the Scottish Tories shouting rubbish. Perhaps what they could do is join with us on these benches and defend Scotland's interests, because let me explain the reality. Over the decade from 2010-11 to 2019-20, Scotland's block grant has been cut by £2.6 billion in real terms, an 8.1% cut. And the people of Scotland should watch what's happening with the Scottish Tory MPs calling out once again, failing to stand up for Scotland's interests. Mr. Speaker, the extent of the, let me say respectfully, that these Tory MPs have been here now for quite some months, and they should understand that if they want to speak, they should try and catch the Speaker's eye. It's undignified to call out the way that they're doing.
Your constituents are laughing at you.
Mr. Speaker.
There's much excitable gesticulation taking place on both sides of the House. I urge members to keep their order papers to themselves and not lash out with their hands gesticulating in all sorts of directions. They are in danger of becoming rather eccentric denizens of the House. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These, after all, are serious matters. The extent of the block grant reduction is highlighted by Fraser of Allender, who've noted that by 2019-20, the resource block grant for Scotland will be around £500 million lower than in 2017-18.
Shameful.
Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the honourable members on these benches who fought so hard on behalf of their constituents to have Police Scotland, Scottish Fire and Rescue Service VAT scrapped. That was a fantastic result. However, the reality is that Scotland has suffered under this policy for the last 5 years. Will the Chancellor be bringing forward plans to return the £175 million which has already been paid? VAT should never have been charged. It was a vindictive measure imposed on Scotland by a Tory government. Give Scotland back the £175 million to invest in our frontline services, and will the Scottish Tory MPs join with the SNP in standing up for Scotland, or will they remain silent on the cash grab that we've seen from Westminster? Mr. Speaker, this Tory government's austerity policies disproportionately affect the most disadvantaged individuals while giving tax breaks to the better off in society. The Resolution Foundation recently estimated that the government's austerity programme will leave the poorest third of households an average of £715 a year worse off by 2022-2023. Mr. Speaker, in Scotland, we have a new progressive tax policy. I can see Conservatives saying, the reality is for most people in Scotland, tax is lower. The Scottish Government are able to reverse this year's real-term budget cut inflicted by this Tory Government and ensure that the majority of taxpayers in Scotland pay less than in the rest of the UK. However, Scotland's new taxation powers should not exist simply to mitigate against UK government austerity. Mr. Speaker, in Scotland, the SNP government have gone further to support those on low incomes. In the recent budget at Holyrood, a package was secured which raises the threshold of a guaranteed 3% increase for those earning up to £36,500, benefiting up to three-quarters of Scottish public sector workers. A Scottish Government on the side of hard-working public sector workers. Mr. Speaker, as we near the EU summit at the end of this month in Brussels, the progress of this government in readying for Brexit has been nothing short of shameful. The UK's government's own analysis tells us that under all scenarios, Scotland would suffer a relatively greater loss in economic output than the United Kingdom as a whole. A no-deal scenario would be significantly devastating, threatening to reduce growth by a massive 9% over 15 years.
Shocking.
Make no mistake that a hard Brexit is going to hit the pockets of families, is going to lead to a loss in tax revenue expectations, is therefore going to affect spending on public services, and yet the Chancellor is silent on the risks to our economy. Risks to our economy when the stresses and strains of a near decade of austerity is hurting. The fact is, Mr Speaker, Scotland is shackled to a sinking ship. The Scottish budget passed last month illustrates the real divergence in political choices across the UK. In Scotland, we have chosen to stand by our outstanding public sector staff and give them the pay increase they deserve. We continue to mitigate the worst atrocities of this government's ideological austerity agenda. We will continue to press for nothing less than continued UK membership of the single market and customs union to prevent the economic catastrophe of an extreme Tory Brexit. And we will never stop fighting to get justice for 1950s women, whom the SNP are so happy to. In conclusion, Mr Speaker, the choices are clear and the opportunity is obvious. The Chancellor must waken up to the economic injustices he has overseen, and he must tell this House, as a matter of urgency, how the economy will stand a hard Brexit.
To the Exchequer.
Well, Mr Speaker, probably as a matter of rather more immediate urgency for the people of Scotland will be how their economy will withstand the highest rates of taxation in the United Kingdom. An economy that under the SNP government is already growing more slowly than the economy of the United Kingdom. I don't know about sinking ship. It's about keeping afloat, I'd suggest to the right honourable gentleman. He talks about earnings, Mr Speaker. I suggest that the right honourable gentleman looks at real household disposable income, which, as I'm sure he knows, real household disposable income is now 4.4% higher than at the start of 2010. We have cut taxes for 31 million people across this country at a time when his government is putting taxes up. We've taken 4 million people out of taxation, improving the ability of people to retain their hard-earned incomes. He talks about Brexit spreading alarm, and he knows very well that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is working tirelessly to deliver a Brexit that will secure British jobs, British businesses and British prosperity. And we would be aided in that enterprise if he and his government would work closely with us to deliver an outcome that's good for the whole of the United Kingdom. He talks about Scotland's budget and the block grant, but of course Scotland now has its own tax-raising powers, and the people of Scotland knows how he intends to use them. And perhaps he's forgotten, but I'll just try to help him with his short-term amnesia. At the autumn budget in 2017, just 4 months ago, Scotland received an additional £2 billion of funding as a result of the measures announced then. And as for the VAT on police and fire services measure being vindictive, the Scottish National Party government was told explicitly that it would not be possible to refund VAT if it went ahead with the police reorganisation. It decided to do so anyway. He may use the adjective vindictive. I suspect my honourable and right honourable friends will be able to think of another adjective to describe a government that pursued such a ridiculous course of action.
Order. Whatever impression may have been given so far, I gently remind the House that this is not a debate, but a question and answer session following a ministerial statement. Nicky Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to congratulate the Chancellor on the balanced approach that he has taken. He and the Prime Minister have rightly identified housing as an economic and social priority, and he'll be aware that the Treasury Select Committee's report on his budget of autumn 2017 recommended that the borrowing cap on the housing revenue account might be lifted to allow local authorities to play their part in building the right homes in the right place Is that something that he will be considering?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. We've already relaxed the borrowing cap in respect of local authorities in areas with high demand and low affordability. We will monitor carefully the consequences of that, how that delivers, and we will keep it under continuous review.
Chris Leslie.
Speaker, the light that the Chancellor can see at the tunnel is the Brexit locomotive barrelling headlong towards him and our schools and our hospitals. What is he going to do to prevent that FTA-style scenario, which his own Treasury officials say will leave a £55 billion train wreck in our public services?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the right honourable gentleman knows, I am committed to delivering a Brexit which protects British jobs, British businesses and British prosperity. And I spend a very significant amount of my working time ensuring that that is the route we follow. I expect that we will make further progress at the March European Council. But I understand the concerns that he expresses on behalf of British business, but I've got to tell him something. I talk to businesses all day, every day. It's my job. And, well, he says so does he, so he will know this already. Business is concerned about what the consequences of a bad Brexit deal could be. But business is much more concerned about the consequences of the policies advanced by his right honourable friends on the front bench.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I say what a huge pleasure it is to hear the Chancellor so upbeat, even as he said, Tiggerish for all of us on this side of the House. He has right to be so, with the unemployment at the lowest level for 40 years and manufacturing at its best performance for 50 years. And given the answer to my right honourable learned friend over looking for every avenue for money, I wonder at the next budget, given we're about 4 months away from the official departure date from the EU, would my right honourable friend look to possibly put into the Red Book what he plans to do with the money we are no longer going to pay to the EU in our contribution?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's always a pleasure to hear from my right honourable friend. And look, we are absolutely not complacent. We face many challenges as well as many opportunities ahead of us. But what we have is a plan to embrace the opportunities and to rise to the challenges. This country has many advantages that many of our neighbours would give their right arm to enjoy. So we must go forward in good heart, robustly, to seize those opportunities and make the best of our future opportunities. I say to my right honourable friend on the specific issue around tax and spending, of course, in the budget, the forthcoming budget, we will look at taxation and spending over the future period. The OBR, of course, will decide what it presents in its report to the House, and my right honourable friend will have an opportunity to question them about the approach they take when they appear in the House shortly after the budget statement.
Rachel Reeves.
Mr. Speaker. Consumer credit rose by 9% in the last year. The household debt ratio to income is 138%, rapidly approaching levels seen before the financial crisis, with interest rates now forecast by the OBR to rise faster than we previously envisaged. Are we asking consumers to keep the wheels on the road of the economic recovery? Is that sustainable, and is that the right thing to do?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady is right to raise this issue. It's something that we keep under constant review. I talk regularly to the Governor of the Bank of England about personal debt, but she probably will know that personal household debt rose in all but 1 year of the 13-year Labour government, and that it is now at a lower level than it was pre-crisis. So the judgment of the authorities at the moment is that household debt levels are sustainable, but she's right to draw attention to it. It is something we keep under close review.
Justine Greening.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Chancellor could give more details on the announcement that the ONS will work with Treasury on a more sophisticated measure of human capital. In a knowledge-based economy, this becomes more crucial than ever for driving our economic productivity. Could you give us more details of the timelines and the nature of that work?
Well, I'm glad my right honourable friend has intervened, because she's given me the opportunity to thank her for sparking this line of inquiry in a letter that she wrote to me. I did challenge the Treasury with the challenge that actually they are more focused on the returns to infrastructure investment than to skills investment. And when we looked at it in detail, we discovered that the metrics for measuring the returns to investment in human capital are not as well developed as they should be. Now, this is something that the ONS has to take forward, but it is important as we move increasingly into a knowledge-based economy with a huge technological set of technological changes ahead of us, that we are able to compare appropriately and objectively investment in physical infrastructure with investment in human capital, and that's what we'll be able to do if we get these new metrics right.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is doubtless aware that the OECD this morning published their own growth forecasts, putting us at the bottom of the OECD economies with a forecast growth this year of 1.3%. So I think it's pretty clear that there is no Brexit dividend on the scene for the British economy. It is to be welcomed that the deficit is getting back to a manageable level, but the Chancellor of the Exchequer must know, because even his own backbenchers are telling him, that extra money is needed now for our hospitals, for our schools and for our police. And that money isn't there because of the previous decisions to make premature cuts to capital gains tax and inheritance tax. The Chancellor must have heard the Institute for Fiscal Studies calling for increased capital investment in housing, up to 3% of our economy. Why doesn't he listen to the IFS?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, he knows and I know that our economy does still face uncertainty as we go through the negotiation process with the European Union. And I am convinced from every conversation that I have with business leaders, with investors, that as we deliver greater clarity about our future arrangements, our future relationship with the European Union over the coming months, we will see business investment increasing, consumer confidence improving. We beat the forecast in 2017. Let's beat it again in 2018. I do believe economic growth matters. The right honourable gentleman opposite says that it doesn't matter what the level of GDP is. I don't agree with that, because the level of GDP, well, I'll send him the quote if he can't immediately recall what he said. I do believe it matters because it's what drives living standards. And we are putting extra money into public services, £11 billion in 2018-19 that I have put in since I have been Chancellor. And on his point about housing investment, we agree with him that we have a major challenge in the housing market. We've put a significant amount of money, £44 billion, into dealing with this challenge over the remainder of the Parliament. But I have to say to him, there are significant non-financial constraints in being able to do more. There are physical bottlenecks around skilled labour, around materials as well, but it's something we'll keep under review.
Sir Edward Lee.
The present Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer could remind our right honourable friend, the previous Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, that given where our electoral support comes from, it may not be very wise politics to impose a targeted new tax on our older supporters. But he could remind our right honourable friend that after the EU, he will be delighted to know that we will be saving £12 billion a year in contributions to the European Union.
Well, I assume that my right honourable friend is referring to the previous Conservative Chancellor but one, and on that assumption, I think he's probably heard.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The winter crisis in the NHS left us with cancelled operations, ditched targets, patients sleeping on the floor, and a public apology in the end from the Prime Minister. Neither the spring nor the spring statement have provided any easing in those pressures. So given that he knows that November budget is going to be too late to provide any of the additional funding for next year's winter crisis that he knows both the NHS and social care will need, and he knows this both in his heart and in his spreadsheets, will he now follow the Prime Minister and announce a public apology to the staff and patients of the NHS who are going to have to endure next year's crisis because of this failure?
Well, no, Mr. Speaker, I've already made it clear that we admire greatly the work of NHS staff who have faced extreme extremely difficult circumstances during this winter with the flu, the pressures of flu and extreme winter weather. This is a spring statement, not a fiscal event. But I said, and I'll say again to the Right Honourable Lady, that we're putting £4 billion additionally into the NHS in 2018-19, and I have committed to putting further money in 2018-19 to fund a pay settlement for nurses and Agenda for Change staff if the management and the unions reach agreement on that.
Mr. Damien Green.
It's very welcome to hear from the Chancellor such good news on debt and growth, and in particular looking at the effects on the real lives of people in my Ashford constituency, where since 2010 youth unemployment is down 48% and apprenticeships are up 6,850. In continuing his successful balanced approach, will he commit to dealing with the social care sector in particular, because we both know that that's going to be an increasingly important issue in the years and decades ahead?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Of course, he has done a great deal of work on this issue. We are absolutely aware of the pressures on the social care system, and they're not short-term pressures. They're driven by demographics, an ageing population. So we have to do three things. In the short term, we have provided additional money. I put £2 billion of additional support in at spring budget last year. My right honourable friend, the Minister for Housing and Communities, put another £150 million of social care grant in at the local government settlement just a few weeks ago. In the medium term, we have to work to get all authorities meeting the standards of the best. There is excellent practice across the country, but it isn't everywhere. And the variation between delayed discharges between different authorities is completely unacceptable. And of course, in the long term, we are committed to publishing a green paper on social care and the future of social care, which we will deliver to the House before the summer recess.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor says that forecasts are there to be beaten, and I agree with him. So can he explain to me why, since his budget in November, the OBR have not been able to increase the growth forecasts in 2019, 2020, 2021 or 2022? And Mr. Speaker, it can't be the negative impact of Brexit, because the OBR still don't have information from government in order to forecast that. So what on earth is his excuse?
Mr. Speaker, perhaps remind the honourable lady that the OBR's autumn report in November was only 4 months ago. In the normal course of events, one wouldn't expect, in the absence of some shock to the economy, one wouldn't expect economic forecasts to change very significantly. The front-end forecast has changed because the outturn for 2017-18 has changed. The OBR forecast growth 0.2 percentage points lower than it actually turned out to be in 17-18, and that has a knock-through effect, which has increased their projection of growth for this year.
Mr. Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Investing in our economy creates jobs and growth, and successful businesses drive that. Could my right honourable friend tell the House how much the corporate tax take has gone up since corporation tax has been cut? And can he confirm that he'll do nothing to hinder the internationally competitive tax rates we have for corporates in this country?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can, and I'm happy to tell my honourable friend that since we reduced the rate of corporate tax to 19%, the yield, the amount of tax we raise for our public services, for our hospitals, for our schools, has gone up by 54%. And it's clear that being one of the most competitive tax jurisdictions in the G20 is one of the determining factors in many investment decisions coming to the UK, creating the jobs and the prosperity that we need for the future.
Sammy Wilson.
The Chancellor is right to talk up the UK economy when there is good news, because there are plenty in this House who will recklessly talk it down. But, however, there was one gap in the statement today. He did make a promise that there would be an inquiry into air passenger duty and VAT on the hospitality industry, and that report would be made in time for the budget in the autumn. When will he make an announcement as to when that inquiry is going to start and the terms of it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've laid a WMS today that sets out the reviews, consultations, and that is among them. So if he looks at the WMS after this statement is over, he'll see that it's there.
Mark Harper.
Can I draw the Chancellor's attention to the recent research published by the International Monetary Fund, which shows that the choice we made in 2010 to deal with the deficit primarily by controlling spending rather than tax rises as the opposition would have was the right choice, meant that this economy grew faster than our European competitors and has put him in the position where he can deliver more money for our priorities whilst reducing the debt in the balanced way that he sets out.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. No, he's right. It was the right choice. And because we made that choice, throughout that period, we saw employment in this country continuing to grow. We avoided the very high levels of unemployment that many of our European neighbours suffered. We've avoided the catastrophic, generation-blighting levels of youth unemployment that many of our European neighbours suffered, and that will be affecting their economies and their societies not just for a few more years, but for 30, 40, 50 years to come. It was the right decision. We've executed our plan, and we should stick to it.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor's been very upbeat today, but why is he so upbeat when the growth figures show that we have gone from near the top of the G7 and the G20 growth lists to the bottom of both?
That's right. Hear, hear. Hear. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm clear, and I think I've alluded to this already, that one of the factors that's depressing the forecast growth is the uncertainty that still exists around the economy. Now, if she, like me, expects that uncertainty to dissipate over time, then she should look through it to the fundamentals of our economy, to the underlying strengths of our economy. And this is an economy that is in fundamentally good shape. Once we can restore confidence and certainty about our future path, I am confident that those fundamental strengths will deliver increased economic growth.
James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend made a fantastic statement. Does he join me in welcoming the 65% fall in youth unemployment in South Suffolk since 2010? And does he agree with me that whilst my honourable friend, Member for Rushcliffe, is entirely right to mention intergenerational fairness, the worst form of intergenerational fairness would be if we had allowed our youth unemployment to peak, as it has done, to socially dangerous levels in the rest of Europe?
Yeah. My honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course I welcome the very large fall in youth unemployment in his constituency, but that will be from a base which was very much lower than has come to be considered normal in many of our European neighbours. And as he rightly says, this is not just an economic factor, it's a societal factor. Persistent high levels of youth unemployment have a hugely damaging effect, as we've discovered in the past in this country, to our cost. If someone is unemployed during those formative years, they're far more likely to remain unemployed and unemployable for the rest of their working lives.
With Streeting.
Speaker, it's astonishing that Brexit, which is the single biggest risk to the economy, merited only 2 sentences in the Chancellor's otherwise uneventful spring statement. But if the economy and the economic outlook is so rosy, then perhaps he can explain why almost every school in my constituency is facing school budget cuts, why my local NHS trust is in special measures, and why my constituents who are crying out in the face of a wave of burglary, one of the worst waves of burglary we've seen, the police aren't responding because the Metropolitan Police is subject to real terms budget cuts. Isn't that the grim reality facing our country? And isn't it set to get worse because of the hard Brexit course his government is following?
No, Mr. Speaker. The government is pursuing a Brexit that protects British jobs, British businesses and British prosperity, as the honourable gentleman very well knows. And on the question of schools, we've protected schools funding so that it will rise in real per pupil terms over the next 2 years. And as we move to the fair funding formula, for schools, every school will receive a cash increase. On police, the settlement that has recently been voted on by this House provides £450 million of additional resource for police forces across this country. We've protected police budgets since 2015.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The OBR in its report, and I refer to Table B7 and Chart B4, assumes that the Brexit dividend will be recycled into ordinary expenditure. I wonder if the Chancellor accepts this conclusion, and if so, what thought he has given to spending this money, and whether the NHS is near the top of his list.
So, as I suspect my honourable friend knows very well, the OBR, this is the assumption that the OBR have adopted at the last three fiscal events. They have assumed that any saving from a lower contribution to the European Union will be recycled to fund things that would have been funded by the European Union but will no longer be so. Now, how we choose to use that money, what our priorities are, will of course be an issue for this Parliament, although I would note to my honourable friend that we've already made certain commitments, for example to our agricultural community, to maintain the level of spending at EU levels until the end of this Parliament.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say that the levels of hypocrisy from this government is quite extraordinary. How can he pledge to be improving air quality while simultaneously boasting of undertaking the largest road building programme since the 1970s? How can he say that the plastics crisis is urgent and then propose a deadline for the elimination of plastics in a quarter of a century's time? Where is the latte levy? Where is the deposit scheme? Where is the urgency from this action? Why is there such a gulf between government action and the words?
Well, I'm tempted to say, Mr. Speaker, or. Look, the Honourable Lady, I think she's making a fundamental mistake linking the road building programme to air quality. Well, you know, I would urge the Honourable Lady to take at least a medium-term view of the world. The vehicle fleet is decarbonising. Within certainly her lifetime, if not mine, we're going to have fully electric vehicles, probably autonomous vehicles as well. And we shouldn't think of the road building programme as a negative feature. We should think of it as an enabler for a transformation in the way our vehicle fleet works. And we've made announcements today. I hope she'll be pleased with the VED on vans consultation. This is a much needed approach to incentivising van drivers to be able to buy the cleanest and greenest vehicles available.
Robert Halfon.
Mr. Speaker, I strongly welcome the housekeeping dividend my honourable friend has, set out in the spring statement, particularly with its focus on the cost of living and on skills. Could I ask him, with the forthcoming budget, that he continues that focus on the cost of living, maintains the freeze and fuel duty, and develops a skills strategy with the Department for Education to make sure we meet the needs of the fourth industrial revolution?
Well, if my honourable friend will forgive me, I won't make a commitment ahead of the next budget on any specific tax or duty measures, but of course we'll maintain the focus on cost of living and living standards. And you know, he will know, and I certainly know, that one of the biggest problems that we've faced over the last year has been the impact on real wages of high levels of inflation. Getting that inflation back down to target is a crucial priority, and I'm delighted that we're going to see real wages rising again from next month as a result of inflation falling and strong nominal wage growth.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I cannot believe that the Chancellor did not have more to say on the NHS in this statement. The NHS in my area is not just in crisis, it is at breaking point. Now, he refers to putting an extra £4 billion in this current financial year into the NHS. But if you extrapolate what the OBR is saying the NHS will need just to keep current standards of care going and meet rising demand, we need £30 billion at least extra going into the NHS by 2022-2023. We need a solution to this. It needs to be able to subsist across governments of different persuasions. So will he meet the demand that the Member of Parliament for Totnes and others across both houses have made for a proper cross-party convention on how we put our NHS on a sustainable footing? And secondly, will he support the suggestion of his former permanent secretary of his department for a proper hypothecated NHS tax to help give it the funding that it needs? Hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I suspect now is not the moment for a long debate on the structural funding challenges of the NHS. But the honourable member is, of course, right. We have an ageing population. Technology is driving an ever wider array of interventions that can and should be made to support people with medical conditions, particularly chronic medical conditions, and we do have to look at how to ensure that our NHS remains sustainable in the future. And of course we're looking at that issue. I'm not going to give him a commitment today at the dispatch box as to how we're going to do that, but it's absolutely something that we need to do. And I very much hope, as he suggests, that this could be done on a cross-party basis, on a serious basis. But I fear that his front bench will not be able to resist the temptation to try to play politics with any such serious discussion.
Mrs. Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Mr. Speaker, it was excellent to hear the Chancellor talk about educational investment and our human capital. Further to my right honourable friend, the member for Putney's comments earlier, would he explain further whether the Treasury will create standards which will technically value our human capital across our government departments, which can then drive decision-making so that taxpayers' money is best spent to maximise the human capital which we invest so much in through education and training rather than waste it?
Well, we've asked the ONS to look at this and to look at metrics that we could use. The objective is to be able to assess clearly where the marginal pound of capital investment should go to achieve the best effect on the economy. And I suspect that in the future, without wanting to preempt the outcome of that work, I suspect that in the future, in a very rapidly changing economy, we will find that retraining and upskilling is going to be a very large part of our future investment requirement.
Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Chancellor if he'd be good enough to either meet with myself or send me a letter outlining the blockers in the Ayrshire Growth Deal that the UK Government is not yet committed to.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it would be for my right honourable friend, the Minister for Housing, Communities and Local Government, to have that meeting with him, but I'm very happy to pass on that request.
Andrew Bridgen.
Has my right honourable friend made any assessment of the Venezuelan economic model, so favoured by the Shadow Chancellor, where I understand the Venezuelan government has made huge progress on reducing income inequality. Unfortunately, as socialism always does, it's done this by pushing 80% of the population into poverty.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Actually, I was watching Russia Today and I saw a very interesting piece on the Venezuelan economy. Apparently, everything's going swimmingly.
Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to my honourable friend for Wallasey, the Chancellor suggested that our economy will be stronger once there's greater certainty over Brexit. But can he confirm that the Treasury's own analysis published last week showed that under all of the government's Brexit options, long-term growth will be lower than it would otherwise have been? And does he not realise that that will be the true legacy of his government and his party that can no longer claim to act in the national economic interest?
Can I just to correct her on a couple of points? The report that she's referring to, published by the EU Exit Committee, was not a report done by HM Treasury. It was a report, as I think she knows very well, prepared by a cross-departmental group of professionals, the government economics profession, in response to the criticism that had been levied at the Treasury's model that had been used before the referendum. And of course, it didn't model the government's preferred outcome scenario. It modelled a couple of standardised outcome scenarios which the Prime Minister has already rejected. We are not going for a Norway model and we're not going for a Canada model. We're negotiating with the EU for a bespoke solution, and when we have made progress in those negotiations, we will model the outcome that we expect to get. And when Parliament comes to vote on this issue, hopefully later this year, Parliament will have in front of it the output of that modelling.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend for his upbeat performance, standing up for the economy and standing up for our country. As a former soldier, may I just put in a plug for our armed forces? There's no doubt They need more money. We live in dangerous times. Will my honourable friend take this into account come the budget?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as a former Defence Secretary, I yield to no one in my admiration for the armed forces, and I do understand the challenges that defence faces and indeed the complexity of the defence budget, with many very, very long-term projects operating at the very cutting edge of technology. But just in case there's any misapprehension, Mr. Speaker, I'd like the House to be absolutely clear that defence will receive more than £1 billion of additional funding in each year of this Parliament. It is the department with the fastest growing RDEL budget of any department across Whitehall. So while we'll of course continue to look at the specific needs of defence, I wouldn't like anyone to have the impression that, as I've read in some organs, that the defence budget is being cut. It is not. It is being substantially increased.
Mrs. Ellen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much is not under the Chancellor's control, but the question I'm going to ask actually is, a year ago we were promised that making tax digital would be put back to help small businesses. In the intervening time, since the election, very little progress has been made in the countryside on broadband rollout. So will the Chancellor please consider putting this back for small businesses by another year?
No, Mr. Speaker. We made our decision to defer making tax digital, mainly because there was a need for more awareness among businesses and more time to prepare with relevant software and so on. And we're confident that business will be able to roll this programme out on the current schedule. And I also confidently predict to the Honourable Lady that although I readily accept that there is some disquiet among potential business users at the moment, once they're using it, once they've got used to it, they will find that this is something which is hugely beneficial to them, that saves them a lot of time and a lot of angst in their dealings with HMRC.
Chris Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2010, the minimum wage has gone from £5.93 to £7.83 an hour, an increase of 32%. At the same time, the take-home pay of someone working at the minimum wage has gone up by 37% thanks to the increase in the income tax threshold. Does the Chancellor join me in welcoming the fact the government has directed assistance at those on the lowest earnings? And can the Chancellor assure the House that that excellent approach will continue to be at the heart of the government's strategy?
Speaker, we are focused on the needs of those on the lowest pay who are in the workforce. Making work pay, and particularly making low-paid work pay, is a priority. And I'd repeat what I said during the during the statement, that partly as a result of the introduction of the national living wage and its subsequent increase to £7.83 an hour, we now have income inequality in this country lower than at any point under the last Labour government. Income inequality falling in this country when it is rising in all other G7 countries.
Smith.
Speaker, this statement was an opportunity for the government to ease the burden on care providers by offering a solution to the sleep-in crisis. Sleep-in shifts are an integral part of public services, which government has a statutory obligation to provide. Has the government ruled out fully paying the 6 years of back pay entitled to low-paid care workers directly?
I'm just not sure of the end of her question there. If she's asking whether the government has ruled out, the government hasn't ruled out anything. We're still looking at this issue, and of course these workers must have the pay to which they are entitled and which they should have been paid. And what we are doing, the Cabinet Office is leading on this, is working with the key providers to see how best to deliver that in a way that doesn't have negative impacts on the provision of care.
Simon Clark.
Youth unemployment in Middlesbrough, South and East Cleveland has fallen 55% under the Conservatives, which is fantastic news. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the last thing that young people in Teesside need is a reckless borrowing binge to reverse that progress?
Quite right.
Absolutely. My honourable friend is absolutely right. The parts of the country that have suffered for far too long from low levels of employment, low levels of investment, have seen over the last few years investment coming in, much of it foreign investment, employment increasing, wages rising, and they absolutely do not need to take risks with the kind of policies that the right honourable gentleman opposite is proposing, which would plunge us back into a place that we've been before and have no wish to revisit.
Mr. Speaker, people in the same job should be entitled to the same day's pay, and the Chancellor continues to ignore that his pretendy living wage is not for people under the age of 25. Those 21 to 24 will earn 45 pence less an hour, 18 to 20-year-olds 193 less, 16 and 17-year-olds 663 less, and apprentices a full £4.13 less. Why does he believe in state-sponsored age discrimination?
Well, the honourable lady will know, I think, that we also announced, due again to come in April, record increases in the youth rates of minimum wage. But look, we've had several exchanges during the course of this session about the importance of maintaining low levels of youth unemployment and the devastating effects of youth unemployment. So what the government does, and I'm sorry if the honourable lady doesn't like this, but what the government does is take the advice of the Low Pay Commission about the impacts of different levels of pay rates on employment prospects. And we balance the need to give people a fair wage with the need to ensure that we maintain high levels of youth employment in the interests of those people themselves and in the interests of our economy.
Sir Jeremy Quinn.
I welcome the projection that real wages will increase in the coming year. That can only continue longer term if we improve our productivity. In that context, can I welcome not only what the Chancellor has said about human capital and long-term endeavour, but the improvements we've seen in productivity over the last 6 months?
Yes, and my honourable friend is right to draw attention to 2 quarters of very good productivity data. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to change policy or pivot on the basis of 2 quarters data, because data can be revised. But I have to say that we are starting to think that possibly we may just be at the beginning of a turn in the trajectory of productivity performance in this economy.
Mrs. Louise Ellman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liverpool has many success stories, but 30% of children are in poverty, and public services are under pressure as Liverpool City Council loses 68% of its funding, and the whole economy is threatened by Brexit. What is the Chancellor going to do differently to address these injustices?
Well, Mr. Speaker, obviously the best way out of poverty is to get people into work, and the proportion of workless households is at its lowest level since records began, and she will know that 200,000 fewer children are in absolute poverty than were in 2010. So we're focused on using our modern industrial strategy to drive economic growth across our country, across the regions of our country, working with the elected mayors and the devolved authorities to ensure that the investment needed goes in all corners of the British economy to deliver the growth that is the only way to get people sustainably out of poverty and into well-paying work.
Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Chancellor on his progress to date, but now ask him to look at investing in a long-term, innovative strategy and plan for the transport infrastructure, including road, rail, air and sea, in the South West, to drive productivity north and south of the peninsula, and to include a commitment to such a strategy in the autumn statement to build a great South West to rival the Northern powerhouse. We thank him for his support for the Peninsula Rail Task Force. It's welcome, but not enough.
Well, Mr. Speaker, she'll have to think of a snappy name for it, and if she can, please let me know. Of course, we're investing already in the South West, and she'll know that the crucial A303 programme, £2 billion of investment in a vital transport artery feeding the South West. But I'd say to the honourable lady this. I know that many of the bids for Housing Infrastructure Fund have come from authorities in the South West, and we're acutely conscious of the fact that as we ask authorities to build more homes, we have to provide them with the resource to build the supporting infrastructure. And that's the purpose of the Housing Infrastructure Fund. And I hope she'll have some good news when my right honourable friend, the Housing Minister, makes announcements in due course.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The number of apprenticeship starts plummeted after the botched introduction of the apprenticeship levy last year. And I welcome the additional support the Chancellor's announced today for apprenticeships in small businesses. But will he recognise that to get anywhere near the 3 million target by 2020 is going to require much more radical action? And will he return to this at the time of the budget?
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. Our target is to deliver, our commitment is to deliver 3 million apprenticeships by 2020. The introduction of the apprenticeship levy changed the game, and we were always anticipating that it would have an impact on the profile of starts. The announcement today of the additional £80 million is specifically targeted at small businesses, non-levy paying businesses, to help them to take on apprentices. The other thing that will happen in a couple of weeks' time at the beginning of April is that large businesses who do pay the levy will be allowed to transfer 10% of their levy paid to small businesses in their supply chain to support their engagement of and training of apprentices. But of course we will keep this programme under very close review. It's a commitment that we have to deliver, and if we need to intervene in a different way to deliver it, we will.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Page 193 of the OBR report states the future is uncertain and the likelihood of unexpected political developments leads to significant downside risks to public finance forecasts. Can I ask the Chancellor if he sees any of those political downside risks sitting directly in front of him?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I made the point already to one of the right honourable members opposite that in conversation with businesses. Maybe I should just sit down, Mr. Speaker, while the right honourable gentleman conducts his conversation. I made the point earlier that businesses in conversation identify two risks that they are concerned about. The risk of a bad Brexit deal, which will have an impact on the economy, and the risk of the right honourable gentleman opposite ever getting his hands on any of the levers of power in our economy. And of the two, there is no doubt that business, expressed in the voice of Paul Dressler this morning, business regards the risk of the right honourable gentleman as being by far the bigger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor claims that spending on disabled people has gone up. But we know, Mr. Speaker, next month cuts to social security will hit disabled people the hardest. The Chancellor also spoke about apologies. Would he like to apologise to the millions of disabled people that he blamed for low productivity?
Well, of course I did no such thing, but Mr. Speaker, well, no, I didn't. Mr. Speaker, we spend over £50 billion a year on benefits to support disabled people and people with health conditions. That's a record high. It's £7.5 billion higher in real terms since 2010. As a share of GDP, our public spending on disability and incapacity is the second highest in the G7. Second highest in the G7, 2.5% of our GDP, 6% of all government spending.
Mr. William Ragg.
My right honourable friend has struck the right note between the need for financial discipline and justifiable need for investment in public services. With this in mind, at the autumn budget, will he ensure that additional funding is provided for schools to ensure the successful implementation of the national funding formula, which we welcomed in Stockport?
Well, my right honourable friend, the member for Putney, as a former Education Secretary, announced that the fair funding formula would be introduced in such a way that we would protect the per capita spend per pupil, and we would guarantee that every school would receive a cash terms increase, and that guarantee stands today.
Twig.
My right honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor, talked about the increasing number of children being taken into care. In Liverpool, there's been an 11% increase in the last 12 months alone. North West local authorities wrote to the Chancellor last month calling for additional funds to address the growing crisis in children's social care. Can I ask him to address this growing crisis and do so as a matter of urgency?
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, spending on support for the children, the most vulnerable children, has increased by £500 million since 2010. And I think there is a distinction to be drawn here. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the Shadow Chancellor's made the point several times over the last week or so. There is a distinction to be drawn between services provided to the most vulnerable children, children in care, children in the adoption and fostering process and children at risk, and the wider children's services budgets. But I repeat again, we provide £225 billion of spending power to local authorities over the 5-year period. It is for local authorities to decide how they allocate that funding.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There can be no truer test of a government's commitment to fairness and its commitment to the next generation. And I know the 7,110 young people who started apprenticeships in Redditch under this government would agree with him. Can he say more about the funds that he's put aside to help more small businesses, such as I visited last week, to access apprenticeships? And would he agree with me that the best place for his construction skills village is in Redditch, a new town in the heart of the country?
Well, I'm glad to be able to tell the Honourable Lady that there will be 20 construction skills villages, so we'll look forward to the bid from Redditch, and I'm sure that it will be considered carefully. But I mentioned earlier, and I'll mention again, that my Right Honourable friend, the Education Secretary, is putting in an extra £80 million specifically to support small businesses who are non-levy payers with the costs of engaging an apprentice. And at the same time, from April, many small businesses will benefit from the flexibility that allows large business levy payers to transfer 10% of their levy fund to small businesses in their supply chain to support them. And the indication I have from talking to the CBI and other organisations is that businesses are very keen to do this, and that very many of them will make such transfers.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, are the OBR right to calculate in their report that the UK will be making payments to the EU until 2064 as a part of the divorce settlement, and that this will not include any new commitments that the British government may make in the remaining parts of the negotiation? Wouldn't it be better just to stay in?
The Honourable Gentleman's referring to, there are essentially three parts to the payment profile. There's payments during the 2 years, more or less 2 years of the implementation period. There are payments as the EU dispenses the so-called resta liquide over the following few years. And then there's a very long tail of what will be actually very small payments, which relate to pensions. And of course, by their very nature, they will stretch over a very long period, but they are very small amounts of money.
John Stevenson.
Speaker, Carlisle Lake District Airport is about to open. We have a garden village development to the south of the city, and there is the prospects of a Borderlands growth deal. Would the Chancellor agree that the only way to grow the economy and balance the books is through such investments? And would he also agree that it is important for the Government to support such local initiatives as they will help rebalance the economy and sort our finances?
Mr. Speaker, it is local governments, local people that understand best, local businesses that understand best how to grow the economies of their regions. And I welcome the initiatives that he's mentioned. I'm aware of the Garden Village initiative, and I look forward perhaps to being able to visit it in the spring.
Seema Malhotra.
Mr. Speaker, isn't it true that young people in our communities are paying the biggest price for this government's choices and their failures? Local government is facing a funding gap of £5.8 billion by 2020. My council, Hounslow Council, has had a 40% cut in its income since 2010, with more to come. 400,000 children, more children are in poverty than 5 years ago. In some wards in my constituency, that's now hitting 40%. He asked to be judged on his record, Mr. Speaker. Is this a record that he's proud of?
Yes, I am, Mr. Speaker, because the figures that the Honourable Lady gives are not quite right. There are 200,000 fewer children in absolute poverty than there were in 2010. And of course, the crucial point, well, absolute poverty is the relevant measure. The crucial point that the Honourable Lady has simply skirted around is that after the financial crash during the last Labour government, we could have gone down a route which many of our continental neighbours went down, which would have seen hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of young people cast onto the scrap heap of unemployment and left there potentially for decades. We did not go down that route, and we have seen youth in this country relatively low and falling, and that is a huge benefit to the next generation, which will be able to benefit from their engagement in the workforce and as they go forward to benefiting from rising living standards.
Sir Andrew Jones.
Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and the balanced approach to the economy he detailed. I particularly welcome the attention on digital and skills. These are the main issues that businesses are raising with me. I'm hoping that Yorkshire will be one of these local full fibre allocations. Will he continue to focus upon fibre and digital as critical to boosting our national productivity?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. If we don't have these enabling network technologies, a good fibre optic backhaul network, good digital technologies, we won't be able to exploit the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, and we must do so.
Neil Gray.
The OBR says that real earnings growth for the next 5 years is expected to remain subdued, averaging just 0.7% a year. Growth in real household disposable income per person is expected to average only 0.4% per year. So why won't the Chancellor properly fund his government departments to ensure that the public sector pay freeze is properly lifted, as it has been done in Scotland?
Mr. Speaker, the public sector pay freeze has been lifted. We've removed the 1% cap, so it is up to departmental secretaries of state to make appropriate recommendations, provide appropriate evidence to pay review bodies. But we do expect them, where they are recommending settlements above the level that they are already funded for, to use workforce management measures, to use efficiency improvement measures negotiated with the workforce to ensure that over time those things are self-funded through higher efficiency and higher productivity.
Mark Pawsey.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor's right to focus on how the tax system might be used to encourage improvements in the environment. And I know the packaging industry recognises the need to reduce waste and will respond positively to his call for evidence. May I ask him that it would include two things? Firstly, that it's people who cause litter, and he spoke about the need for behaviour change. And will it recognise the important role that packaging has in reducing food waste by keeping food fresh for longer?
Yes, of course, and the point of having a call for evidence is to make sure that the decisions we make are based on full knowledge and full information. He makes a very important point. It would be massively shooting ourselves in the foot to make a change in relation to packaging, which then massively increased food waste and the energy cost of food that was wasted.
Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is the Chancellor refusing to share the light at the end of his tunnel with grieving parents who are struggling to pay for their children's funerals? Their lives are forever blighted in darkness. A children's funeral fund is the dignified, compassionate and sympathetic thing to do.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and she's a tireless campaigner on this issue, and both I and my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, have heard her pleas on behalf of parents in this terrible situation. But I'm sure she does recognise that this is not a fiscal event. There have been no fiscal announcements today, but I'm absolutely certain she will want to make a representation to me ahead of the budget in the autumn.
Giles Watling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Chancellor for his very spring-like statement, and it's good to hear that there's light at the end of the tunnel. But can I ask the Chancellor what plans he has to support our vital £90 billion creative industries sector, which is growing in my constituency of Clacton?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, creative industries is an increasingly important part of the UK economy, and one in which we have a significant comparative advantage. And the government, the best way the government can support the creative industries, apart from the obvious one of training and skilling, is through supporting the rollout of digital technologies on which so many of the creative industries these days depend.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor will have, and I have many more, families who work on the national living wage. Does he agree with the Roundtree Foundation, who have demonstrated that a two-parent family, one working with 2 children, because of tax credit cuts, will be £450 a year worse off? That's not fair shares, is it?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the national living wage has given a pay rise of more than £2,000 a year to anyone in full-time work since it was introduced in 2015. And on top, and of course, it's not just the national living wage; it's the increase in the personal allowance, which means people are now able to keep more of what they take home. And because it's an allowance rather than a rate cut, it disproportionately benefits those on the lowest earnings.
Alan Mack.
Mr. Speaker, fourth industrial revolution technologies are transforming and boosting productivity across the whole country, particularly amongst the SME sector. As my honourable friend considers future spending priorities ahead of the budget, can I urge him to continue and accelerate support for our entrepreneurs and innovators who create the wealth of the future?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a tireless advocate of the technology that will fuel the fourth industrial revolution. And the important thing is that while we're talking about it, this is actually happening across the country. These technologies are actually being used by large, medium and small businesses. They're not just something in the laboratory or the university classroom. They are actually happening in the factories and business parks across Britain, and they will transform the way we live and the way we work.
Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Chancellor will agree with me. It's not talking down the economy to report in this place the real lived experiences of the people we represent.
That's right.
The majority of whom are not going to see real average wage incomes exceeding the pre-crash levels until 2022. Does he not agree with me that all of the measures announced today and the rhetoric will not make a difference to the people who need it the most until their average incomes increase above the pre-crash levels? When will that happen?
Mr. Speaker, raising real income growth is the principal target that we focus on. But look, the country suffered a recession after the financial crisis, which wiped out 6% of our national income. And we are rebuilding our economy from that crisis, hindered and hampered by the fact that the previous government was ill-prepared for the crisis when it came. And what we're determined to do, and what I've made clear today, we're determined to make sure that our economy and our public finances are in good shape to deal with the economic cycle in the future, because we do not believe that we've abolished that economic cycle, and we do have to prepare for future downturns, because that's the nature of economic life.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the progress that's been made in reducing the debt and deficit, but would the Chancellor please confirm that we're still spending £50 billion in debt interest, more than the armed forces and the police force combined? And if we don't get control of this, there will be less money for the things that we value, like the Housing Infrastructure Fund, Oxfordshire's excellent submission for which is so important to my constituents.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. This is current spending. This is £50 billion that we could be spending on hospitals, on schools, or indeed, if we chose, on investment in infrastructure. And the right honourable gentleman opposite's answer to this is to increase the amount of borrowing that we have, to increase the amount of money we're pouring down the drain every year on debt interest, reducing the amount of money that is available for our public services. That cannot be the right way to go.
Ms. George.
Thank you. In spite of the claims for what will happen to real wages on April Fool's Day, the fact is that real wages are now lower than they were in 2010, and debt has actually grown over twice as fast under this government than it did under the previous Labour government, in spite of the global economic crash in 2008. So will the Chancellor agree that his strategy is failing people like my constituents who are suffering from £6 billion of cuts to social care and can can no longer get care packages, so they can die at home surrounded by their loved ones, but instead are stuck in hospital.
No, Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with the honourable lady, and her numbers are wrong, as I'm sure she knows. The soaring deficit in 2009-10 has created a legacy that, of course, was going to lead to increasing debt. Our challenge has been to get the deficit down so that debt can now start to fall. And as debt starts to fall, we are able then to fund our public services, to invest in Britain's future, to provide some relief for hard-pressed families and small businesses through easing their tax burden. And that is exactly what we intend to continue to do.
Alex Burkhart.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. A number of honourable members have mentioned the next generation. Is it not the case that only this government's approach can really deliver true intergenerational fairness, because the alternative is ever-increased borrowing, which will be put on the shoulders of young people?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and this is a point that needs to be made more often. When the right honourable gentleman opposite talks about borrowing an extra 100 billion, 250 billion, 350 billion, whatever it is he's thinking about this week, when he talks about nationalising an industry for 190 billion pounds or whatever it is, he's talking about burdening the next generation with yet more debt that will blight their future and limit their chances. It isn't fair and it isn't right. We must make sure he never gets the chance to do it.
James Frith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are some small businesses in Bury picking up the pieces still from the Carillion collapse. Small business confidence in the North West is at its lowest in 4 years, with UK skills shortages blamed for some £3 billion in lost earnings. Mr. Speaker, he chose to come to the House today to give us the spring statement, and he had nothing to say. We heard a fake news forecast with nothing for the real job creators. So will he actually give some certainty for the small businesses providing the jobs in towns like mine, and stop this outsourcing to puffed up vehicles like Carillion that appear to be too big to fail before they do fail?
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the statement, the reason I've come to the House to make a statement is because the OBR has published its second report of the fiscal year. It is mandated by Parliament to produce 2 reports a year, and I think the House would have regarded it as a gross discourtesy if I had published the report without coming to the House to answer questions on it. I'm glad that he mentioned skill shortages, because he will recognise that while skill shortages are a serious problem, this is, in a sense, a better problem to have than skilled people looking for employment. The work is there, the jobs are there, the economic growth is there, and now we have to respond to it by delivering the skills that people need. And on outsourcing, we will continue to pursue the best value for money for every pound of taxpayers' money we spend. Where that involves collaborating with the private sector, that is what we will do. And the way we've handled the Carillion situation has ensured that public services continue to be provided and the public purse has not had to bail out a private company.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join the SNP Finance Secretary in Holyrood in acknowledging the additional funding and increase in Scotland's Brock grant, which means 479 million extra coming, which is a real-term increase over the next few years. Considering the lower than 1% increase in Scotland's GDP growth that is forecast, will my right honourable friend commit to driving economic activity across all our constituencies through initiatives such as the Stirling and Clackmannanshire City deal?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's just a pity that the SNP spokesperson here didn't feel inclined to acknowledge the same thing. But yes, he's right. We are a government for the whole of the United Kingdom. And it isn't the Scottish people's fault that they've got a government that is adopting policies that are depressing economic growth in Scotland and will depress it further in the months and years ahead. We will go on delivering policies that are designed to improve the economy across the whole of the United Kingdom, including the growth deals in Scotland.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week it was revealed the Ministry of Housing returned £1.1 billion to the Treasury in unused housing money over the last 2 years. That's money that should have been spent on recladding tower blocks that are unsafe after the Grenfell Tower. So will the Chancellor use his autumn budget to fund the work that's required to keep our tower blocks safe and the residents inside them safe as well?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've made the point, and my right honourable friend, the Housing Minister, has made the point that local authorities, social landlords, who have blocks that need recladding should carry out that work. Any work that is required for urgent safety reasons should be done. Any authority or housing association that is unable to fund that work, that has a genuine inability to fund that work, should get in touch with the Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government, who will work with them to find an appropriate solution. Safety critical work must be carried out. That is a legal obligation of the landlord. We will work with them to make sure that it is.
Maggie through.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to welcome my Right Honourable Friend's continued commitment to increasing the housing supply, and also would like to put in a bid for error wash for the Construction Skills Village as well. But does he agree with me that it's measures such as the Housing Infrastructure Fund and the cut in stamp duty for first-time buyers that will help many of my constituents realise their ambitions and their aspirations to get on the housing ladder?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The housing investment package that we've put together is important because it has ensured that financial support will not be the constraining factor in building more homes in this country. We have other constraints. We have skills constraints, we have land supply constraints, we have material supply constraints, but finance will be available. And the measure that I announced in the autumn budget, removing stamp duty for 1 million first-time buyers, will allow 1 million, mostly young people, once again to be able to aspire to the dream of home ownership.
Henry.
Mr. Speaker, under cashless and digital, the Chancellor claims that he will ensure that cash is available for those that need it, and he further claims that his is the party of small business. If he stands by this, will he come to Nairn, Granton and Aviemore to explain to business why, with over 70% in the shares of Royal Bank of Scotland at his command, he is failing to block the closure of their branches, which the FSB say will make it more difficult to do business in Scotland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely always a pleasure to visit Nairn, but I don't have an immediate plan to do so. And as the Prime Minister has told him and his honourable friends on several occasions, we do not interfere in the day-to-day management decisions of Royal Bank of Scotland. But look, just to treat this seriously, the consultation that we've published today is about cashless and digital payment systems, but it specifically acknowledges, and I said in my statement, that we also have to ensure that cash is available to people who need it. And if he looks at the consultation when it is published, he will see that we are determined to address that issue, and I hope he will engage in that consultation.
Kevin Ollinrake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor is absolutely right to look at the impacts of the VAT threshold on business. It is a disincentive to growth and an incentive to avoid tax through cash deals. But does my right honourable friend agree this is not just the financial implications of registering for VAT, it's also the administrative impact of that? And is it an appropriate time to look at the entire system of the VAT regime?
Well, I think that would be rather dramatically widening the scope of the intended consultation. I'd remind the House that when I referred to this issue at the autumn budget, I did say that I was not minded to lower the VAT threshold because I recognise that the VAT threshold at its current level does keep a lot of small businesses out of the administrative burden of VAT, but we are very keen to ensure that this cliff edge effect, which does have a damaging impact on businesses that are trying to grow, is addressed if it's possible to do so, and the consultation will pursue those ideas.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a reason why we need to invest in our public services. In York, our schools have gone from the seventh worst funded to the very worst funded authority. Our NHS is in the capped expenditure process and no social housing has been built. Should not the Chancellor invest in our children, in the sick and provide homes for the homeless?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid it's a characteristic of the party opposite that they're only able to see the world through the lens of inputs. Well, reality is this. Since 2010, we've increased the number of schools that are good or outstanding, so 90% of schools are now good or outstanding. 1.9 million more children are being taught in good or outstanding schools. That is the metric that matters to parents and to children themselves in terms of their life chances. It's not always just about the money, it's about the outcomes.
Ross Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the measures introduced by the Government to help the oil and gas industry, including a £2 billion package of support, as well as the introduction of transferable tax history, which has been a much-needed shot in the arm. With the oil and gas industry set to contribute over £1 billion in tax to the Treasury this financial year, can my right honourable friend tell me what further steps the Government can take to support this vital industry?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr Speaker, we are committed to the oil and gas industry, and as my honourable friend knows, we are committed to measures that will ensure that every drop of economically recoverable oil and gas in the UK continental shelf is recovered. That's very much in the interests of the Scottish economy, the UK economy and Her Majesty's Treasury. And I'm delighted that the increase in the oil price, together with the uptick in activity as a result of it and as a result of the measures we've announced, means that the contribution of the oil sector to the UK Treasury will again become positive in the year to come.
Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The party opposite has cut the Welsh Government budget by around £1 billion a year since 2010. The knock-on impact of that on public services in Wales and on Welsh local government to deliver key services has been huge. Will the Chancellor today apologise for the failed Tory austerity that has caused so much damage to public services in Merthyr Tydfil and Rumney and across the UK? And given his outline of a rosy picture, will he set out today what plans he has to adequately fund public services that many, many people rely on?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr Speaker, if I don't have the figures right to hand, but if my memory serves me correctly, at the budget last year I was able to confirm that Wales will receive over £1 billion of additional funding, including as a result of changes to the formula that were agreed. So not down, but up. An additional £1 billion plus. And the failure of services in Wales, which we catalogue regularly across this dispatch box, mainly in the Welsh Health Service, are a result of decisions made by the Welsh Government, priorities set by the Welsh Government, not decisions made by the UK Government.
Thank you,
Mr Speaker. Economies move in cycles. Does my right honourable friend agree that there is a moral case to ensure that our public finances are in a state to help the poorest in society, some of whom live in my constituency in Cheltenham, when that next slowdown comes? And does he also agree with me that that's an approach that the party opposite manifestly failed to take?
They did, Mr Speaker. My honourable friend is right, and it's precisely because we've seen the devastating impact of being unprepared for what was a very serious economic downturn from a financial crash, that we are determined to ensure that the UK economy is robustly prepared for the next normal cyclical downturn whenever it occurs. These are normal things. They happen in everyday economic life, and we must be able to ride through them without damage to our economy and without the poorest in our society paying the price, because it's the poorest that always pay when Labour's model fails.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Following the global financial crash, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, introduced by Obama, saw $800 billion investment pumped into the US economy, leading to the most sustained period of growth. By contrast, the UK embarked on a sustained period of austerity. UK growth is now half that of the US and the Eurozone. Which was the right ideological choice?
Well, Mr Speaker, the United States is in a different position from the United Kingdom. Sadly, we no longer operate the world's reserve currency. We're no longer able to borrow in the conditions that the United States is able to borrow. Decisions for the United States economy are for the United States administration. The government has made the right decisions for the UK economy, and the benefit of those decisions, the outcomes that we're now beginning to see, demonstrate the case for them.
Order. Presentation of Bill. John Mann.
Housing and Planning Local Decision-Making Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 16th of March, sir.
Friday the 16th of March. Thank you. Order. We come now to the 10-minute rule motion. Mrs. Teresa Villiers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to prevent the Holocaust Return of Cultural Objects Act 2009 from expiring on the 11th of November 2019. Mr. Speaker, it was on the 10th of November 1938 when the horrors of the Nazi persecution began in earnest with the shameful episode known as Kristallnacht. Lives were lost during that terrifying night of broken glass. But a key focus of the violent attacks which took place was also property, the homes, buildings and businesses owned by Jewish people. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, property of all kinds was systematically stolen from millions of people as part of Hitler's horrific genocidal campaign against Europe's Jewish community. That included many precious works of art. It is estimated that up to 20% of Europe's cultural treasures were lost during World War II. Around 100,000 cultural objects pillaged during the Nazi era remain still hidden to this day. The horrific crimes of the Nazis can never be remedied, but there is action that we can take to return works of art to the people from whom they were stolen. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the last century, there was growing international awareness of the risk that looted art might have inadvertently been acquired by museums and galleries. This led to the 1998 Washington Conference on Holocaust-era assets. At that conference, a number of countries, including the United Kingdom, pledged that they would work to identify treasures stolen by the Nazis and seek to return them to their rightful owners. Compared with other European countries, it seems that very little looted art found its way to the UK. But that should not be used as an excuse for inaction. In 2000, the previous Labour government established a panel known as the Spoliation Advisory Panel